The first fragile light of dawn brushed faint strokes of gray across St. Peter's Square, but the world around him felt suspended in something deeper than darkness, something heavier. He stood motionless, halberd gripped tightly in both hands, the steel biting cold against his gloves. Each breath he drew felt too loud, too fragile, as if even the act of breathing might shatter the sacred silence that hung over the square like a burial shroud. They were assembled in perfect formation, line of crimson and gold against the pale stone. Yet within their breastplates, hearts beat erratically. Young hearts, old hearts, breaking hearts. None of them had spoken since taking their places. It was forbiddance. But the silence was more than discipline. It was reverence. It was grief. Their commander moved along the ranks, his boots echoing sharply against the ancient cobbles. He stopped directly in front of Adrian. The young guard straightened instinctively, swallowing against the tight knot in his throat. "Even if your hearts are torn apart today," the commander said, his voice low, each word carrying the weight of centuries, "you do not abandon your post. Not for tears, not for sorrow, not even for love." His eyes lingered on Adrian's a fraction longer than on the others. Perhaps he saw the storm gathering behind them. Then he moved on. From the far end of the formation, an older officer, one whose beard was dusted with white, whose steps carried the fatigue of a lifetime of service, added quietly, almost reverently, "Today, we are not merely guarding a man, we are guarding the soul of the world." The words struck deep. Adrian clutched the halberd tighter, feeling the worn leather of the grip dig into his palms. And beneath the breastplate, against his heart, he felt it, the folded square of fabric hidden inside his tunic. A handkerchief, not grand, not ornate, simple cotton, white, with a single word embroidered in careful, humble stitches. Courage. It had been given to him by Pope Francis himself. He was barely 19 when he first swore his oath before him, trembling and unsure among giants of tradition. That day, after the ceremony, Pope Francis had taken him aside, his hand warm on his trembling shoulder. "You will find," he had said, smiling gently, "that true courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it." Then he had pressed the handkerchief into Adrian's hand, as if entrusting him with something infinitely precious. "Keep this close," he had whispered, "and when the moment comes that you doubt your strength, remember that I never doubted it." He had carried it with him every day since. And now, today of all days, it felt heavier than ever before. The casket had not yet appeared, but the atmosphere had already thickened, pressing down on them like the humid air before a storm. He could see the distant shimmer of the crowds massed at the far end of the square, thousands of faces blurred together in grief, pilgrims, priests, officials, the faithful, the broken-hearted. They had come not just to say farewell, but to bear witness to history, to finality. The halberd in his hands felt less like a weapon and more like an anchor tethering him to his oath, to his brothers, to the legacy he was sworn to protect. His heart thundered beneath his armor, each beat loud and wild and afraid. Would he hold the line? Would he honor him as he deserved? Or would he betray the pride that had been placed in him? The thoughts chased each other in frantic circles through his mind. But outwardly, he was a statue, a sentinel carved from grief and duty. Then, at last, the bells of St. Peter's Basilica began to toll. Their deep, sonorous voices rolled over the square, over the rooftops of Rome, over the rivers and hills beyond, a sound so vast and solemn, it seemed the earth itself must pause to listen. The final call, the farewell that needed no words. Each strike of the bell felt like a blow against his chest, a reminder that this was real. That he was gone, that they were here to stand in his stead one last time. Tears stung the backs of his eyes, but he blinked them away furiously. Not now, not yet. He shifted his stance imperceptibly, pressing the haft of the halberd deeper into the ground, grounding himself. He breathed, he endured, and as the last echo of the bell faded into the waiting silence, he whispered so low that only he could hear, "For you, Papa, for the courage you saw in me. I will stand." The great bronze doors of the basilica stirred, and the world held its breath. The heavy tolling of the bells faded into a deep, aching silence. And in that silence, his mind slipped backward, drawn irresistibly into memory. He had not always stood so tall. He had not always carried the weight of this uniform with ease. There had been a time not so long ago when he was little more than a boy trapped inside a man's armor, clumsy, insecure, painfully aware of his own inadequacy. It had happened during one of their first public drills in the Vatican courtyard. The commanders were merciless that day, barking orders with the sharpness of blades, pushing them past exhaustion into the realm where only instinct remained. His instincts, however, betrayed him. As the formation pivoted to salute, his halberd slipped from his grip, clattering noisily onto the stones for all to hear, gasps from the onlookers, a sharp bark of disapproval from the sergeant. The sting of 100 eyes burning into him. He scrambled to retrieve the weapon, his hands fumbling, his face hot with humiliation. The drill carried on without him, a tide he could not catch. When it ended, the commander called him out before the assembled ranks. A public rebuke, necessary, he said, to teach discipline. To teach shame. He stood there, rigid with humiliation, feeling as though the weight of the world had crushed him into the earth. Later, alone, he sat hidden in the shadows of the courtyard's farthest corner, his head bowed low, the world blurring through the burning in his eyes. He had failed. He had disgraced the uniform. He was certain they would send him away. He didn't hear the footsteps until they were nearly upon him. Looking up, he froze in shock. It was him, Pope Francis, the Holy Father himself, alone, without guards or entourage, moving through the courtyard with a quiet grace that seemed to defy the very rules of the world. He approached and sat down beside him, lowering himself with a soft grunt onto the cold stones. For a long moment, he said nothing, neither did Adrian. The silence between them was not awkward, it was sacred. Finally, Pope Francis spoke, his voice low and warm, carrying the wisdom of countless years and countless souls. "No one," he said, "grows without falling first, my son." Pope Francis turned his gaze to him, then eyes filled with a compassion so vast, it seemed to swallow up all the shame and fear Adrian carried. He smiled. "Falling is not failure," he said. "Refusing to rise again, that is the only true failure." Adrian opened his mouth to apologize, but Pope Francis shook his head gently, silencing the words before they could escape. "Stand up," he said instead. "Stand tall. Because I believe in you." From within his robes, Pope Francis produced a small square of fabric, a handkerchief, plain, simple, humble. He placed it into Adrian's trembling hands. Embroidered in one corner, in careful, deliberate stitches, was a single word: courage. "This," he said, his hand closing briefly over Adrian's, "is for when you forget who you are." He stood then, as quietly as he had come, and disappeared back into the labyrinth of the Vatican without another word. Adrian sat there long after he had gone, the handkerchief clutched to his chest, feeling for the first time in his young life that maybe, just maybe, he was enough. He had carried that piece of cloth with him ever since. It lived against his heart, sewn into the lining of his tunic, a constant, silent reminder of the faith Pope Francis had placed in him when he had no faith left in himself. Now, standing here in the vastness of the square, Adrian could feel at once more the soft press of fabric against his chest, the invisible weight of the Pope's hand upon his shoulder, and his voice whispering across the chasm of memory, "Stand tall, Adrian. I believe in you." The casket approached, borne aloft by solemn hands, wreathed in the sorrow of 1,000 prayers. Adrian's knees trembled. His breath came ragged. But he straightened his spine, lifted his chin, and anchored himself in the strength Pope Francis had given him. He would not fall, not today, not before him. "I will not fail you, Papa," he whispered into the mist, "not today." And as the casket drew nearer, the rain began to fall again, soft, steady, as if the heavens themselves wept for the man who had taught so many to stand. It began with a trembling at first so slight that only Adrian could feel it. The subtle, traitorous quiver of his knees, locked tight in position. The cold sweat gathering beneath the collar of his uniform. The casket drew closer. The slow, solemn pace of the bearers brought it nearer with each agonizing heartbeat, the gold of the cloth almost luminous under the gray sky. And with every step, the weight pressing down upon Adrian's chest grew heavier until it was no longer a burden he carried. It was an ocean, threatening to crush him whole. He fought it. He fought harder than he had ever fought in his life. Breathe, Adrian, stand. You are a Swiss guard. You are his son. But his body was no longer listening. His vision blurred around the edges, the towering pillars of the basilica swaying as if in a dream. A roaring filled his ears, an indistinct, rising sound, like a tide pulling away from the shore before a great and terrible wave. He locked his knees harder. He ground his teeth together. He whispered inside his mind the sacred words that had sustained him. Courage, you are not alone. And then, just as the casket passed before him, just as the echo of the bells rang out across the stones, the world tilted, and he fell, not with a cry, not with a crash, simply, silently. The halberd slipped from his grasp, clattering once against the ground before rolling gently to a stop. His knees buckled, his body crumpled forward, and darkness swallowed him. Later, they told him what happened next. He would not remember it clearly, but in the deepest places of his heart, he would feel it always. The instant he fell, there was a tremor through the ranks, a ripple, almost imperceptible, like the shiver of a flag in a dying wind. But none of the Swiss guard moved in panic. None broke formation, none turned their heads. Instead, it was the brothers directly behind him, silent, sure, who stepped forward in perfect, fluid synchronization. One slipped the halberd from the ground, cradling it with the same reverence one might hold a relic. Another bent low, checking that he still drew breath. And a third, a young guard not much older than he, pressed his hand briefly to his chest, over the place where the handkerchief of courage lay hidden. No words, no shouts, only action swift and solemn. Somewhere nearby, a stretcher appeared, summoned by some unseen signal, some prearranged understanding that grief might strike harder than any enemy. With the utmost care, they lifted him onto it, shielding his body from the eyes of the gathering throngs. And then, without breaking the sacred cadence of the procession, they began to carry him away. The crowd saw. The tens of thousands who filled St. Peter's Square saw. And yet not a murmur rose among them. Not a whisper, not a laugh, not a single cruel glance. Instead, as one, the pilgrims and dignitaries, the priests and the common faithful alike, bowed their heads. A wave of reverence rolled across the square, deeper and more profound than anything the ceremony itself could have scripted. They bowed not to shame, they bowed to grief, to loyalty, to the cost of love worn opally upon the battlefield of the heart. As he was carried past the rows of guards, each man dipped his head ever so slightly, acknowledging him not as a failure, but as a brother who had given all. The casket moved onward, into the basilica, beacon of hope and sorrow, disappearing into the embrace of stone. And he, cradled in the arms of those who shared his oath, left the square behind, bathed not in humiliation, but in the pure, searing light of brotherhood. He woke to the cold kiss of damp cloth against his forehead. The ceiling above him was ancient stone, dimly lit by a single flickering lamp. A medic hovered nearby, murmuring reassurances he barely heard. He struggled to sit up, pain flaring through his muscles, but stronger than the pain was the shame, a deep, knowing certainty that he had failed him. Failed the man who had trusted him, failed the brotherhood he had sworn to honor. Tears welled up, hot and angry. But then a hand, strong and steady, came to rest lightly on his shoulder. He turned. It was his sergeant, the same man who had once barked orders at him with the ferocity of a storm. Now, his eyes were soft, proud. "You did not shame us, Adrian," he said quietly. "You reminded us why we stand here in the first place." He opened his mouth to argue, to protest, but the sergeant shook his head. "You fought until your heart could bear no more," he said. "And even in falling, you honored him." He placed something into his hand. The halberd, cleaned, polished, waiting. "Come," he said simply. "If you can stand, you can serve." And so, with shaking limbs but a burning heart, Adrian rose. He took up his weapon once more. He wrapped the handkerchief tighter against his chest. And he stepped back out into the waiting night, to stand again, to keep watch again. Not as a symbol of perfection, but as a testament to a loyalty that no fall could ever break. The square awaited him. The stars hung silent overhead. And in that silence, he found his strength again. The first sensation that greeted him was the coarse linen of a blanket against his skin. The muted scent of antiseptic and old stone filled his nose. Slowly, painfully, he forced his eyes open. The infirmary was dim, lit only by a few guttering candles. The world beyond its walls was a muffled hush, the weight of grief still palpable, even here. He sat up slowly, every muscle in his body aching in protest. And with the ache came the shame. Did I fail him? Did I betray the uniform, the vow, the memory of the man I had sworn to honor? The thought gnawed at him, worse than any pain. Footsteps stirred near the door. He turned to see the captain of the Swiss Guards standing there, a tall, commanding figure whose stern face had guided them all through countless drills and ceremonies. The captain approached without a word, pulling up a simple wooden chair beside his bed. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Then he spoke, voice low but unyielding. "How do you feel, Adrian?" He swallowed, throat dry. "Shamed, sir," he whispered hoarsely. "I failed in front of the whole world." The captain's mouth tightened, not in anger, but in something close to sorrow. "You did not fail," he said quietly. "You showed the world what it means to love enough to fall." He shook his head, unable to meet the captain's gaze. There was so much more the captain didn't know. A truth he had carried alone for so many years. He clenched his fists tightly on the blanket, then found the courage to speak. "I was a child when I first met him," he said, voice trembling. "An orphan, 10 years old, lost, angry at the world." The captain listened, silent and still. "One day," he continued, "he came to the orphanage. Not as a figurehead, not for cameras, he came alone. He knelt beside me when I wouldn't speak to anyone else. He gave me a rosary, and he told me I mattered. That I had a place in this world." A lump rose in his throat, but he pressed on. "I made him a promise that day," he whispered, "that I would protect him with my life if need be." Tears blurred his vision, but he didn't wipe them away. "And now, double quotes." Adrian drew a shuddering breath. "Now, the only thing I can do is see him to his rest." The captain's face softened. Without a word, he rose to his feet and extended his hand. "If you can stand," he said, "then your place is with your brothers." Adrian took the captain's hand and allowed him to pull him to his feet. His legs wobbled, but his resolve was iron. Piece by piece, Adrian donned his uniform once more, the familiar weight of armor grounding him, the halberd steadying his hand. As he stepped back into the night, the air bit cold against his cheeks, but his heart burned with a fierce and wavering fire. The square loomed before him, vast and solemn beneath the silver stars. The casket had already been carried inside the basilica, but the square itself still thrummed with prayers. He walked across the stones, slow but steady, until he reached the steps of the great basilica. There, he knelt. He bowed his head low to the earth that had borne the final journey of the one he had sworn to protect. And in the silence, he whispered, "Goodbye, Papa. Thank you for saving that little boy. I promise, I will carry you with me for the rest of my life." He pressed his forehead against the stones, and then, slowly, he rose. Across the square, the formation of Swiss Guards still stood, silent sentinels of loyalty and love. He made his way toward them. When he reached the edge, the captain met his eyes once more and simply nodded. No grand speeches, no dramatic gestures. Only a place made ready for a brother returned. Adrian stepped back into formation. His hands were steady on the halberd now. His back straight, his heart strong, and though his eyes still burned with tears, they burned even brighter with pride. The bells tolled again overhead, their deep voices echoing across the night sky. And he stood among his brothers, witness, protector, son. Not because he had never fallen, but because even in falling, he had never truly left him. He would carry him forward in every vigil, in every oath, in every heartbeat, always. The first day had ended. The casket now lay in state inside the grand heart of St. Peter's Basilica, where tens of thousands would come to pay their final respects in the days ahead. The city did not sleep. The world did not breathe. And neither, it seemed, did Adrian's soul. As the first night's vigil concluded, the captain approached him once again, his figure outlined against the lanterns, casting long, solemn shadows across the marble. "You should rest, Adrian," he said gently. "You have already given more than enough." Adrian looked him in the eye, feeling the steadiness now rooted deep in his bones. "Sir," he said, voice clear despite the exhaustion tearing at his body, "it would be a greater pain to stand down." The captain studied him for a long moment. "You wish to continue?" he asked quietly. Adrian nodded without hesitation. "Until the last bell rings," he said. "Until the final prayer is whispered, I will remain at my post." He hesitated, then his heart pressing against the walls of his chest. "Sir, this is not duty for me. This is a promise made long ago by a boy who had nothing but a dream, and a pope who gave him the courage to dream it." The captain's gaze softened. He placed a firm hand on Adrian's shoulder. "Then you will serve," he said simply, "not because you must, but because you are called. Permission granted." Adrian's heart surged with a gratitude too vast for words. That night, while Rome slept fitfully beneath the morning sky, he donned his armor once more, buckled the familiar weight of duty across his shoulders, and took his place inside the basilica. There, under the soaring arches and the eternal gaze of the saints, Adrian stood silent watch beside the body of the man who had changed his life. Hours melted into one another. Pilgrims came in endless streams, old and young, rich and poor, faces lined with sorrow and hope alike. Some wept openly, some prayed in broken whispers. Some simply knelt in silence, their heads bowed. And through it all, Adrian stood unmoving and wavering, a sentinel for love, a witness to the flood of devotion Pope Francis had inspired across the world. On the second day, Adrian's body began to betray him once more, his legs aching, vision swimming. But each time he felt himself falter, he closed his fingers tighter around the handkerchief hidden in his tunic. Courage, each letter stitched into the cloth, pulsed like a second heartbeat against his chest. By the third day, the guards rotated more frequently. Many were given orders to rest. But when Adrian's name appeared on the next roster, he did not hesitate. He saluted and returned to his place. Other guards, older, stronger, offered to take his shifts, but he declined, gently but firmly. This was his vigil. This was his vow. He watched as cardinals, kings, and paupers alike passed through the sacred space, all kneeling before the man who had given his life to lifting theirs. He stood witness as mothers held up their infants to receive a silent blessing, as soldiers saluted, as old women crossed themselves through tears. He stood because the Pope had once knelt beside a lost boy and made him feel seen. He stood because his heart had been cradled by the Pope's kindness. He stood because love demands more than comfort, it demands everything. On the final day, as the preparations for the burial began, the captain found Adrian again. He looked tired now, older, somehow, under the weight of the world's sorrow. But when he saw Adrian standing there still and bowed despite the ravages of grief and fatigue, he smiled. "A rare, fleeting thing. You have honored him well, Adrian," he said. Adrian bowed deeply. "No, sir," he whispered. "He honored me first." And as the bells began to toll for the last time, as the choir raised their voices in a hymn older than the stones beneath their feet, Adrian closed his eyes briefly and offered one final prayer. "Thank you, Papa, for giving a lost boy home, for giving him a mission greater than himself. I will carry you with me until the end of my days." When the casket was finally lowered to its eternal rest and the great doors of the basilica closed upon the sacred chapter they had witnessed, Adrian remained standing at attention. Silent, steadfast, grateful, a son to the end, and far beyond. If you believe that loyalty is a vow written not in words, but in the silence of the heart, subscribe to Guard's Moments today. Here, every story is a living echo of honor that never fades. Because duty is more than a protocol, it's a promise, and promises are forever.